Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. I, I get the esteemed honor to introduce to you two speakers that we have with us today, colleagues from the NSF, to talk about their new directorate on technology, innovation, and partnerships. So NSF Directorate on TIPS. I don't think that they call it that acronym yet, but I'm sure it will grow to become a household name in the near future. And so first, we have Dr. Irwin Gianchanddi with us as a senior advisor for this new director, reporting directly to Ponch, our NSF director. And for 6 years, Irwin was the NSF Deputy Assistant Director for Computer and Information Science and Engineering, and twice serving as NSF Acting Assistant Director for the same directorate. In this role, he contributed to the leadership and management of NSF's SICE Directorate, including formulation and implementation of the directorate's $1 billion annual budget. He'll tell us about the budget for this new TIPS program shortly. Strategic and human capital planning and oversight of day-to-day activities. In recent years, he led the development and launch of several new NSF investments, including a smart and connected communities, platforms for advanced wireless research, and the National AI Research Institute. Before joining NSF almost a decade ago, Dr. Gianchanddi was the inaugural director of Computing Community Consortium, providing leadership to the computing research community and identifying and really pursuing audacious high-impact research directions. He has published extensively and presented at many conferences, and this isn't the first time he's been with the FDP. So we welcome him and his colleague, Gracie Narcho, who's a senior advisor to the Office of the Director for NSF, focusing on technology, innovation, and partnerships, this new TIPS directorate. Prior to this role, Ms. Narcho served as a senior advisor to the NSF Directorate for Computer and Information Science and Engineering. Seemed like they've worked together for a while, where she was instrumental in developing industry government partnerships for FY21 AI solicitations. She also served as one of the co-leads for NSF Partnerships team, streamlining processes and procedures for NSF partnerships with industry, nonprofits, and other federal agencies and international funding organizations. Ms. Narcho previously served as Deputy Division Director for the NSF Division for Industrial Innovation and Partnerships that supports high-tech small businesses and collaborations between academia and industry to transform discoveries into innovative commercial technologies with societal benefits, including the Small Business Innovation Research, SBIR, and our STTR programs. She's done an extensive amount of work, been with NSF and the federal agencies for over 30 years, and they will first share about a 30-minute presentation, and I will help moderate questions and answers at the end of our session. So without further ado, I give you our colleagues, Irwin and Gracie, to share about this exciting new directorate.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Nobles, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for having us at FDP again today. First of all, let me just check and make sure that you can see the slides okay and you can hear me okay. All right, great.
You can, you sound good.
Battle number one when we do this virtually. So thank you so much, Robert, for that really generous introduction. And Gracie and I are delighted to be with you and really delighted to give you an overview of the plans for the proposed Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or TIP Directorate. Let me say a couple of words at the outset here, and then we'll dive into, as Robert said, about a half-hour presentation. And if you'll allow us, we would ask that you please hold your questions, just since it's a pretty large group this afternoon. Really great to see so many folks sticking with FDP through the course of the day today and into the evening session here. But if you could hold your questions until the end, we're hoping we'll be able to address some of them through the course of the presentation, and then happy to field whatever questions remain at the end as well. One thing that I wanted to just say at the outset, though, so some of you, I'm sure, are well aware of the president's budget request for FY22, which calls for a new directorate for tech innovation and partnerships at NSF. You're probably also aware of the various pieces of legislation that are on the Hill at the moment, whether it be the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act in the Senate, which calls for a directorate for technology and innovation at NSF, or the future of the NSF, NSF of the Future, I never remember which one's first, act that was passed by the House that calls for the establishment of a Directorate for Science and Engineering Solutions, SES. And then there are, of course, other legislation, appropriations language for FY22, as well as Build Back Better and so forth. What I hope you will see over the course of this talk over the next half hour or so, and we'll see over this discussion, is that we really see the ultimate aim here to be one of trying to both support new and emerging technologies, critical technologies that allow us to be able to maintain US competitiveness in areas like artificial intelligence and quantum information science and advanced wireless and sustainable materials and so forth. The list goes on. And at the same time, also being able to address some of the foremost societal challenges that we face today. So in some sense, if you think about the pending legislation on the Hill, and the president's budget request. The budget request really is sort of at the middle between what we see in the House and the Senate. And really that's how we sort of view the thinking at NSF with regard to this proposed directorate for tech innovation and partnerships. So with that, I'm going to dive in and start off first with a little bit of motivation. So why a new directorate? The last time NSF established a new directorate was almost 32 years ago at this point. And we've had our existing directorates for quite some time. What motivates us to think about a new one? Well, I think you would all agree that we face in many ways a pivotal moment in our country today with respect to where things stand from a national and from a societal standpoint. And there are three examples, three illustrations of that you see on this particular slide. The first having to do with the changing climate. We've seen the wildfires just in the last few weeks in Colorado, earlier last year in California. We've seen the devastating tornado outbreaks that took place in Kentucky and other parts of the South and the Southeast in the recent past. So clearly a changing climate that serves as one area of potential scientific discovery and pursuit. Another is this notion of equitable access to education and healthcare and other aspects, equitable access to information, for example, through broadband connectivity, which even today is not equitably served across this country. I think we've seen this paramount over the course of the last 21 months as we've borne witness to the COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges that you have when you don't have equitable access to education, healthcare, broadband connectivity, and the like. And then a third example having to do with critical and resilient infrastructure, really thinking about some of the challenges that we saw, for instance, in Texas, and I don't mean to pick on any one state, but the challenges that we saw in Texas back in February of last year, shortly after a very unprecedented winter storm that effectively brought the power grid in that state to a halt for a period of time and had lasting consequences as far as the economy, as far as people's livelihoods, people's lives were concerned. And these are just three examples. There are other examples of how we see societal challenges that we face today on a day-to-day basis that we feel we have an opportunity to, as a scientific and engineering community, to potentially bring science and engineering capabilities to bear to help address those. And indeed, if we think about the science and engineering enterprise for our country, and we go back over the course of the last 5, 10, 15 years or so, we've seen how there have been transformations even within this enterprise as well. For example, the pace of discovery has dramatically accelerated in nearly every field of science, engineering, even the humanities, as a result of access to unprecedented amounts of data, as well as access to a whole slew of emerging technologies like AI and machine learning that allow us to be able to do analytics on those data and extract meaningful insights and knowledge from those data. If we think about faculty today, many of you on this call today, I'd argue that, at least in the conversations that we've had with colleagues, there's a significant interest on your part and on the part of early career faculty, folks who are going into the scientific endeavor today, to really bring their knowledge, bring their skills to bear to be able to address some of the societal challenges and really have positive impact on society with science and engineering at the end of the day. And then a third piece of how the science and engineering community itself is evolving is thinking about partnerships. Thinking about where STEM talent is today. If you go back 10 years ago, if you go back 15 years ago, we've long had talent in academia. We've had talent in industry research labs at times as well. But today we see STEM talent really distributed across all sectors, startups and small businesses, philanthropic organizations and other nonprofits, state and local governments, not to mention the federal government as well. And so we feel we have an opportunity today to be able to bring that talent together, really harness that talent as blended teams that partner together to be able to tackle some of our foremost science and engineering challenges. So, in other words, a pivotal moment for society in terms of the societal challenges that we face, also an opportunity that we have today because of where the science and engineering enterprise is to be able to begin to address, not just begin, but continue to and enhance and accelerate addressing some of those societal challenges as well. So having said that, we put this slide up just to sort of illustrate the NSF mission space. Many of you have probably seen a version of this slide, sometimes called Pasteur's Quadrant, that speaks to different facets of research that are supported or taking place in our country on any given day. NSF's mission space, I hope you would agree, largely rests in the top half of this chart. The spectrum from pure basic or curiosity-driven research to much more use-inspired, solution-oriented research activities. And if we look back at the history of NSF over 71 years, now entering 72 years, we have supported research activities across that spectrum. Take artificial intelligence, for example. We have investments in foundational AI work, thinking about new knowledge representation, learning, reasoning, planning capabilities. We also have use-inspired investments that think about AI in the context of food and agriculture, AI in the context of transportation, and so forth. Pure applied research on the bottom right-hand corner is an area that we don't spend a lot of time doing at NSF. That is, of course, a mission space that's covered by other agencies like DOE and DOD in the federal government. And then finally, translation and innovation, sort of a third dimension along this axis, if you will, as you have translational possibilities out of all elements of research. Translation and innovation is an area that NSF has focused on as we've led out of the federal government over the years investments in programs like Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR, that other agencies have subsequently adopted as well. So as we think about where we stand today, and again, going back to that pivotal moment, some of those societal challenges, as well as where the science and engineering enterprise is today, we see an opportunity to be able to double down on investments that we make in use-inspired basic research, as well as in translation and innovation types of activities. And that sort of constitutes the mission space for the proposed Tech, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate. So if you look at our existing research directorates and offices today, we have investments across the spectrum, as you all know, from bio to social and behavioral and economic sciences, and a lot of affinity between each of these directorates and the corresponding communities of bio and computing and geosciences and so forth. Though I would argue there's a lot of cross-cutting activity that happens across these directorates even today, as you see through this sort of honeycomb type of illustration. We see the proposed TIP directorate as one that's really emphasizing that cross-cutting nature of the foundation. It's a new horizontal, if you will, one that really serves to enhance the use-inspired research and the translational research that's taking place at different levels across our different directorates, really serving to elevate and amplify and accelerate that activity across the foundation as we look to the future. So I hope that gives you a sense for how we think about sort of the motivation and the mission space, if you will, for the proposed Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. And now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the budget numbers and the President's budget request specifically for FY22. So this is a table from the FY22 budget request. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular slide, but really just serving to illustrate that the way we envision this is potentially 3 distinct divisions. So a division on innovation ecosystems, one on technology frontiers, and one on translational impacts, as well as a strategic partnerships office that allows us to be able to build out partnerships between NSF and other organizations in the federal government and private industry, nonprofits, and so forth, to be able to accelerate and enhance the impact of the work that we're trying to support. And you can see the relative budget numbers, and you can see the total budget for the directorate that was proposed in 22, $865 million. And I'll come back to that in just a bit. But let's take these 4 units, if you will, and let's now talk about these units practically in terms of the thematic areas that we're hoping to support with this investment. So you see at the bottom here are existing directorates and offices that support research and education and infrastructure activities. And you'll see sort of an illustration of the horizontal nature of this directorate, at least as we're thinking about it. So sort of as a foundation, as a building block, the first tranche of activity is really focused on partnerships, really trying to think about ways in which we can engage in partnerships with other stakeholders. Again, other agencies, the private sector, and so forth. We can streamline and enhance those activities so that we can bring expertise to bear to be able to help shape some of the research directions that we're supporting in a collaborative way, to be able to really help inform the research directions that we're pursuing, much as we do today through our conversations with the research community, actively speaking. So partnerships really serves as a foundation, as a building block of what we want to be able to do. One level above that is thinking about the technology and innovation ecosystem and ecosystems across the country that we're hoping to cultivate. And now here on this slide, you'll see in blue, sky blue, if you will, some of the investments that are existing across the foundation. So we have long supported the I-Corps program. We've, in the last few years, supported the NSF Convergence Accelerator. So those are examples of programs that would be moving into the TIP directorate, at least as part of this budget request, this budget proposal. And then they would be complemented by the investments that you see in green, these investments over here on the right that constitute new investments that we would make, that we would launch as part of the launch of the TIP directorate. So for the tech and innovation ecosystems, this is really about trying to cultivate at the local, the regional, the national levels, the ecosystems of bringing together academia and private industry and state and local governments and civil society and others to be able to motivate and inspire some of the research directions that we want to pursue in technology areas and at the intersection between technology areas and some of our societal challenges. 3 new investments, and Gracie will talk about these in a little bit more depth in just a moment. Regional innovation accelerators, co-funding for some of our flagship emerging technology areas, industries of tomorrow. So co-funding, for example, for the National AI Research Institutes program, because we get every year in that program and other programs in various technology areas, significant number of proposals. And so providing additional funding to help support use-inspired research activities in those areas. And then entrepreneurial fellowships as well. And again, Gracie will talk in more depth about some of those new programmatics in just a moment. One level above this is the technology translation space. So we've talked about partnerships as a building block, technology and innovation ecosystems at the regional and national levels, and then emerging from those ecosystems, new technologies that are ripe for translation, either into startups and small businesses. And we have a vibrant lab to market platform with Partnerships for Innovation and SBIR, STTR, the Small Business Innovation Research, Small Business Technology Transfer programs. So being able to bring those programs into the TIP directorate to create to continue to support the lab to market platform and enhance that, but also innovative pathways as well. So thinking about ways in which NSF funded research could transition not necessarily to a startup or small business, but potentially to an open source ecosystem, potentially to government, whether it be state or local government agencies that might adopt NSF funded research outputs, ways in which NSF funded research could have opportunities for institutional change as far as education research outputs are concerned in institutions of higher education. So what are the innovative pathways that allow us to be able to build out sort of the more translational research piece along the lines of what we're doing successfully today with SBIR, STTR, and the lab to market platform? Across all of this, I think a really important element for us is people. We want to be sure that at the end of the day, the work that we're supporting through these areas of effort, through these thematic areas of emphasis, that work is going to be able to harness the geography of innovation that exists all across this country. We want to be sure that we're supporting researchers at different institution types, researchers of different backgrounds and expertise sets, researchers in different locations. And we really do want the technical innovation to be balanced by geographic innovation as well. I talked about some of the societal challenges that we face that can help serve to drive new technologies. Those societal challenges don't look the same whether you're on the West Coast or the East Coast or the South or the Midwest, depending on what that societal challenge is. Sometimes they might, but oftentimes they don't. And so what are the sort of unique geographic characteristics that also play into this as well? And so how do we train that next generation of talent at all levels to be positioned to address this work and positioned for jobs on day one as well? One final thing I'll say about this slide that I think is really important. You'll notice the realigned investments, programs that are moving over to TIP, about $365 million, and new investments, about $500 million. And this is at the President's budget request for FY22. President's budget request for FY22 calls for an NSF budget of $10.2 billion, which is about $1.7 billion more than the FY21 budget level. So of that $1.7 billion, $500 million of that coming to this directorate as new investment. And the reason I say that is to just try to illustrate that this is not about robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's not about taking from our existing directorates to make headspace for TIP. It's about trying to constitute a balanced effort that balances the innovation that we absolutely need our existing directorates to be able to support, because that research, that activity serves to drive in turn the activity that the TIP directorate can fuel as well. And then one last slide for me is to just illustrate, I hope you'll see how the TIP directorate really aligns with NSF's budget priorities for fiscal year 22. Everything from enhancing fundamental research and development, maybe more on the use-inspired side for TIP, to strengthening our leadership in emerging technology areas, advancing equity. I talked about the emphasis that we have on talent, talked about the emphasis that we have on really broadening participation of all different individuals, all different organization types and so forth. Really addressing societal challenges to include climate science and sustainability. And one final piece is this notion around the construction of forefront infrastructure. We need to be thoughtful about living laboratories, for example, and other research test beds that allow us to be able to conduct the experimentation in these technology areas, allow us to be able to do the prototyping and piloting that keeps us moving forward as far as the innovation ecosystems that I just talked about. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Gracie to give you 3 examples of programs that would come out of the TIP directorate, including existing ones as well as new ones, just to give you a sense for some of the areas that we're thinking about focusing on. Gracie?
Thanks, Erwin. So the first one we're going to talk about is about enhancing, strengthening, and scaling the lab to market platform. So as you look around this circle, you see the different elements of that platform, from demonstration to translation to education and validation, and the different programmatics we have at NSF to support that effort as well. For example, a couple of directorates have a transition to practice supplemental funding opportunity. that enables researchers and students to do that initial hardening or maturing of ideas or research results. The very initial stage, even within the lab context, to be able to start with moving that research result further down the translational pathway. Erwin, can you click slides? Oh, perfect. Thank you. So then again, we also have the Partnerships for Innovation, or PFI program, that has traditionally lived in our Division of Industrial Innovation and Partnerships. It was pioneered there to allow for collaborations with private industry that enable researchers and students to license the outputs of NSF-funded research to third-party corporations and startup companies while still working in the lab. The I-Corps program that NSF established in 2011 helps provide experiential entrepreneurial education to researchers with the opportunity to go through customer discovery to ascertain if there's a product market fit for their idea. Now, we've seen nearly 800 startups created to date as a result of the I-Corps program, and you can see the level of investment for I-Corps in the FY22 budget request here. But we actually consider it, and even as well as a success, even if a startup isn't started. If we're saving a researcher time and effort of trying to create a startup around an idea that doesn't have a market fit, we've done that researcher a huge service. And most often what we hear is that they take that learning, they go back to the lab and they think about their next research project quite differently. And they are looking for a better problem to solve where there's a market for it the next time they do their next project. And then finally, we have our SBIR and STTR programs, which were pioneered at NSF in the 70s, which serve as a construct to allow our community to develop transformative deep tech and high impact technologies and progress through phase 1 and phase 2 and move into products and services with commercial and societal benefit. So this is, of course, a lab to market platform that NSF is very proud of and enables us within the TIP construct to think about how can we grow this platform and continue to serve all of science and engineering as part of that horizontal that Erwin described. So this is one example of a suite of programs that would be a part of the TIP directorate and would serve some of the functional attributes of TIP that he described earlier. Now, another is the notion of regional innovation accelerators, something that we talk about in the budget as well. This is about being able to cultivate new innovation ecosystems at the scale of communities or regions throughout the country. Here, the goal is to balance both the scientific and technical goals that we have with broader societal benefits that we want to achieve. You can see the rendering at the bottom is really meant to illustrate both the combination of societal challenges like climate change and equitable access to healthcare and education and critical and resilient infrastructure that Erwin mentioned earlier, as well as a suite of technology areas that NSF has long supported and continues to support, like AI, advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, and so forth. And what we see here is an opportunity for innovations in the technology space to shed light on how we think about and how we approach some of the societal challenge areas, and for the societal challenge areas to in turn drive innovations in AI and wireless and others as well. So that sort of bidirectionality is something we feel very strongly about in the context of these regional innovation accelerators. So something that's critical here is balancing both the science and technology and engineering innovation with geographic innovation, as Erwin mentioned. So when you think about some of these societal challenge areas like climate change, there are differences and nuances between what we see on the West Coast versus what we see in the South, or what we see in the Midwest versus the Northeast and so forth. So it's important that we tap into the location-specific expertise around what are some of these challenges as well. So that takes us to what makes these regional innovation accelerators in some ways distinct from existing investments that we already have across the agency. So here we have a very intentional and critical focus on co-design and co-creation. So really trying to put a spotlight on the users, the beneficiaries, the consumers of the research outputs, being engaged intimately from the start in terms of being able to motivate, shape, formulate, and help to design some of the research questions that we're tackling. We want them being engaged side by side with the researchers through the conduct of that research, through the piloting and prototyping activities that take place, and ultimately through the translational aspects of the activities that we support. So the earlier engagement of the broadest set of stakeholders across different sectors we see as critical, not only in motivating and shaping the research, but also in facilitating a paradigm shift where we move a bit away from a technology push to much more of a market pull in terms of the research activities that we're supporting and the outputs that we engender as a result. So where we've traditionally funded good ideas and funded research at universities, and then when there's a discovery or a good idea, we look around for what use we can apply that to in the market. Here we're saying, let's get that market engaged early on. Let's get those users involved so that when those research outcomes are developed, they can be accelerated to market and to solving solutions in the problems of society. Now, we believe a key thing here is getting the active engagement of those partners and regions from the beginning to be able to ensure that we're building a regional innovation ecosystem from the start that's poised for longer-term sustainability that goes above and beyond what NSF resources might be available, both during the duration of the award and beyond the lifetime of NSF funding. Now, another way to think about these regional innovation accelerators is by looking at some point examples of what's happening successfully in this space across the country today. We could render Silicon Valley or Kendall Square in Cambridge on this chart, but we picked 4 different examples for illustrative purposes. So there's the robotics ecosystem in Pittsburgh around the universities there, the medical device industry that's congregated around the hospital in Nashville. Then you can think about the electric power grid in Chattanooga and how that has served as a basis for a gigabit connectivity and in turn the basis for a gig economy. And of course, the Air Force Base and some of the defense industry around that Air Force Base in Huntsville, Alabama. So these are 4 examples of regional innovation economies that have been cultivated over several years. And the question we ask as part of this regional innovation accelerator activity potentially is, can we see about creating opportunities for every community in every state across the country? Can we expand that geography of innovation? Can we allow for folks to engage in STEM research and educational activities to the point that we're really addressing some of those societal challenges that are location specific, but also addressing some of the key technology areas that we've talked about? And can we try to replicate some of the aspects that have been successful in some of the areas that Erwin talked about in other parts of the country going forward as well? And could we use this construct to develop the workforce of the future? Not just creating new PhD research and scientists, which of course is something we care deeply about, but we also want to develop innovators, entrepreneurs, technicians, and practitioners. And can we do that collaboratively with industry and state and local government partners? So we support activities like experiential learning, or vocational training, internships, apprenticeships, and fellowships. So that's the second investment area that we wanted to talk about, the regional innovation accelerators. And then a third is entrepreneurial fellowships, which is also called out in the President's budget request, as potential pathways for PhD trained scientists and engineers to be able to forge connections between the outputs of their academic research efforts and government, industry, and investors, to be able to see if they can mature their ideas and help move them from lab to market. So as I mentioned, we have a very successful I-Corps program that allows folks to be able to do that entrepreneurial training. But this is an opportunity for us to provide folks with a year or 2 of resourcing, access to incubation space, access to potential connections and networking, to see if they can harden some of those ideas and technologies through a cohort model, and then potentially use that experience to replicate it again down the road, perhaps as serial entrepreneurs. So that's an example of a third potential investment area, which would be new in this case as part of the TIP construct. So we hope this gives you a sense of how we're thinking about a technology innovation partnerships directorate, really focused on use-inspired convergent research, very much an emphasis around innovation and technology translation, while still leveraging the virtuous cycle of foundational and use-inspired research and activities across that spectrum through that active engagement and active collaboration with all of the other directorates across NSF. So I would be remiss if I didn't clarify that thinking through issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility are also front and center in this TIP directorate. We see this as a tremendous opportunity for collaboration across the agency and an opportunity to engage with a host of new stakeholders to have tremendous impact on the geography of innovation. So I think I'll stop there and leave time for questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Gracie, and thank you, Dr. Giancandani. We really appreciate the insight that you shared related to this new directorate. From listening to you, really sounds that you're really working to elevate public and private partnerships, strengthen the pipeline through multiple activities, even though I want to ask you a little bit about the priorities for which, because you kept saying might, we may be an area of investment. So I'm curious related to your strategic planning. And then tech transfer and other industries like Autumn, where where there's this speed and there's a lot of work that comes in the middle. But what you just described with TIP is very exciting for where we are. There's a couple questions already in the chat, so I'll jump directly to them, but then I'll circle back around related to some of the information that I heard in this presentation. One of the questions is, it really looks like OIA, the integrative activities, cross-cutting programs, they may roll up into the new TIP directorate. So one would describe it as the tip of the iceberg. Can you speak to if there's any roll-up activities in this new directorate?
So Robert, I'm happy to take that one, and Gracie, feel free to weigh in too. So as a starting point, I would not say that the OIA activities now roll up into the new TIP directorate, period. I can maybe appreciate where that impression comes from, but that's certainly not our intent. I think that if you look at the portfolio of programs that OIA supports, whether it be investments in really leading the agency's investments in mid-scale infrastructure, the EPSCoR program that we support through OIA, a whole host of investments that the agency leads out of OIA. We expect those activities to continue for sure. And I think that those are really important and pressing activities that we absolutely must see continue. This directorate is really, the mission space is really about that emphasis on technology frontiers, particularly at the intersection with societal challenges. And of course, that has to be done in collaboration with all of our existing directorates, but then also thinking about technology translation to something else that I think, Robert, you were going to ask about, and so on. So I think that there are distinct mission spaces. Now, there is a point of intersection that makes a good deal of sense, and that is around EPSCoR. That is around some of the work that's happening out of OIA to broaden participation, for instance. And I think that work continues to need to be led by OIA and others across the agency, and we need to partner with them as TIP. Once TIP comes to pass, to be able to facilitate that and to be able to ensure that, for instance, when we talk about the regional innovation accelerators that Gracie talked about, we are talking about investments across the country, and we are really ensuring that there is strong engagement from EPSCoR jurisdictions and also from a diversity of institution types, EPSCoR or otherwise. That's what I would say to that.
No, that's helpful, because the next question really speaks to that. This intersect between SBIR, STTR, which will come into your directorate, and EPSCoR. How does it all fit into the new directorate, and what does partnership with EPSCoR, which you just highlighted, mean? Or how is it envisioned?
Yeah, so I'll take that one, and maybe Gracie can talk about SBIR, STTR. She commented on that, just reading that question a little bit during the talk, but we can elaborate a little bit more. So with respect to EPSCoR, I will just say that we've already started the conversations with Loretta Moore and her team, for instance, within the EPSCoR section within OIA, talking about ways in which, what are the lessons that we can learn from some of the larger EPSCoR tracks of support that we have and we offer, and at the same time, what are ways in which we can work with the EPSCoR program to communicate about TIPS programs. Again, should the directorate come to pass, how can we communicate those to a broad audience that goes beyond, with all due respect, goes beyond strictly R1 institutions, or goes beyond to touch all of the EPSCoR jurisdictions as well. And so we've started those conversations. There's really not much more that I can say, since we're in the midst of trying to think about funding opportunities and so forth. But I think you can rest assured that, look, for us, Gracie said it well, at the end of the day, we are really intentionally trying to ensure that we are designing into TIP from the beginning this engagement with the broader ecosystem. And if we don't do that, I think, frankly, we have failed at a huge portion of our mission space. We've had conversations, for instance, about together with EPSCoR and even independent of EPSCoR too, depending on the nature of the conversation, having dialogues with HBCUs and HSIs and tribal colleges to better understand some of the challenges and needs and opportunities and the ways in which NSF can work, NSF and TIP in particular can work with them as well. Gracie, do you want to say anything else about that? Or I saw there was a question about—
I was going to answer the question about SBIR and STTR, which, as I mentioned, launched at NSF in the 70s and then was written into legislation and spread across 10 other federal agencies. So that SBIR and STTR programs had been living within our engineering directorate in the Division of Industrial Innovation and Partnerships. But for NSF, we coordinated that program within one division for the entire directorate. We had program directors that did only SBIR and STTR funding, and I think NSF may be unique in that regard. So that program and its program officers will be moving into the TIP directorate, continuing to represent the entire breadth of the areas that NSF funds, but will sit within the new TIP directorate when that directorate is created.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all optimistic that it will be created. Looks like I'm looking at the new leaders of the directorate as well. The next question that surfaced is related to I-Corps. And one of my colleagues who's attending asked, where can I find raw data used to assess the effectiveness of I-Corps programs? Some seem to think that it was at VentureWell, but it's been hard to locate. Do y'all have any information related to I-Corps effectiveness?
I'm happy to start that answer, and Erwin can jump in and add to it. So under the American Innovation Competitiveness Act, NSF is required to report on the I-Corps program, not just for our program, but for other federal agencies as well. And so that requires that a report be issued every 2 years. I believe the first year it went out was around maybe 2017 or 2018. So the second report that was due was just issued recently. And so I know that there should be 2 of those assessment reports available on the NSF website.
Thank you. I was part of an I-Corps program historically, and the student and innovation that was coming out of that was quite promising. So thank you for that. Next question. During our federal agency updates, we heard about Naval X. Will NSF TIP work with other federal agencies such as DoD with overlapping scope? And y'all kind of mentioned that. You touched on this during the presentation. So the question specifically Naval X and other DoD overlapping activities.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, absolutely. So we are actively trying to engage with other. So let me back up and say NSF itself has a long history of partnering with other agencies, and more recently with the private sector and other stakeholders as well. And I think that in the context of the TIP directorate, we are keenly interested in being able to partner with other agencies in shared topic spaces and be able to bring their expertise to help motivate the research and lend itself to the work that our research community can do. Great example of this, you mentioned DoD, so I'm just gonna, it's on the top of my mind. Great example of this, NSF just recently issued a broad agency announcement, a BAA, through the Convergence Accelerator in partnership with DoD, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for R&E, Research and for R&E, and in that collaboration in particular, DoD and NSF are working together to be able to jointly support research in next generation wireless capability, 5G wireless capability. So that's a $20 million effort where DoD is is providing significant resources to be able to advance that sort of mission space. And so the short answer to the question is absolutely, we are actively looking to our partners in the other agencies, and we do that through known contacts. We do that through interagency groups that we serve on. We do that through a number of means. We also do that, by the way, through the recruitment efforts. So should TIP Directorate come to pass, I think one of the things that we are keenly aware is we want to be sure that we're recruiting for talent that maybe has a little bit of a different perspective to the management of research activities that we support, and that also has connections and networks into other agencies. And so you could imagine us potentially recruiting folks who've spent time in other agencies and can bring that perspective to bear as well. So I think there's a lot of different ways in which we look to partner with the other agencies.
So when you talk about bringing other individuals over from other agencies, possibly to join the directorate, how large, we didn't hear about how large a footprint you're thinking TIP may become. Has there been any thought related to that?
Yeah, so great question, Robert. So you saw in the budget numbers sort of $865 million at the president's budget request. And I will tell you that when you look at the existing programs, right, and I see a question in the chat about a lot of emphasis on translational efforts and entrepreneurship. So if I may, Robert, maybe I'll tackle that here as well, right?
Keep going.
Part of that stems from the fact that when we think about the existing programs that would be moving into the TIP Directorate, that's probably a workforce on the order of about 60 to 70 folks right there, right, who serve those existing programs, Lab to Market, Convergence Accelerator, right, and an existing budget of about $385 million. Getting late on the East Coast. And so anyways, so when you talk about, that would be our existing footprint on day one in terms of transitioning some of those programs. Now, if we were to get additional resources to help support the TIP Directorate, I think that our plans, right, when we talk about regional innovation accelerators, when we talk about opportunities to be able to spur that sort of single investigator, small team creativity in use-inspired research activities, right? When we talk about the prospects of being able to engage with other stakeholders at the state and local and national levels to be able to support that use-inspired work. And then when you dovetail that with some of the translational programs that we have now, plus new translational programs that we could stand up, I think that potential to scale is there, right? I think we are eager to see that scale growing, but I'm going to yield to my colleagues on Capitol Hill about sort of the wants and the intents with respect to what TIP Directorate, the size and scale and scope of TIP Directorate, and that an NSF might look like over the coming years. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, but 385, you asked for 500. There's currently 70. One could extrapolate that it would be somewhere 80, 90 additional individuals. So.
Well, so I'd be just a little careful about extrapolating. I mean, I hear where you're coming from. I'd just be a little careful about extrapolating because I think part of this is some of the new programmatics, the size and scale of individual awards may vary, right, in some of those new programmatics. And so just how many folks you would need to manage those larger size, maybe fewer larger sized awards in some cases, right? There would be another set of programs as well that would support sort of the single investigator, small team science as well. So I don't know that it's a complete extrapolation, but yes, I think we are looking to grow, right? We are looking to grow even at that budget request level with an additional footprint that allows us to be able to manage these programs.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Let me make sure before I move on from the question of basic science, because you put together the 4 quadrant, the majority of the conversation was in that far right-hand quadrant, but NSF's bread and butter has been with basic science research. Is that a focus of this directorate, or is that to be left with the other directorates?
So again, when we think about basic research, we think about that spectrum from foundational, curiosity-driven basic science to more use-inspired basic science. And I think that for the purposes of this directorate, the focus is more on the use-inspired side, and then the use-inspired basic science piece. And it's a spectrum, right? It's not like a wall, and then you say, okay, this is strictly foundational and this is strictly use-inspired. It's a spectrum, and there will inherently be opportunities for overlap. There ought to be opportunities for overlap, but I think that we really see this as that spectrum. And if you think about that spectrum, some of our existing directorates are more on the left-hand side of that spectrum, and TIP is more on the right-hand side of that spectrum. And then additionally, TIP has this translational piece that is also a part of the mission space. But I do want to emphasize to folks who may grow concerned sometimes, when we talk about the translation portfolio, keep in mind that that's a portion of our investment. We're really talking about use-inspired research plus translational research.
Yeah, it's very helpful. The next question is really about this concept of creativity. I'll say my colleague, Jerry, pontificated just a little bit by explaining the foundation of U.S. science. But the question with this is this notion related to investigator-initiated ideation and industry-driven ideation for solving problems. And I was going to ask the same question whenever you think about, and we saw a remarkable example of this with COVID, that we had a problem that we were trying to find science to fit and be responsive to, and at my university and many of our universities, we were called by NIH and DARPA and a number of agencies related to that, but not necessarily NSF. So could you talk a little bit about the creativity component of the investigator versus where you're seeking ideas from to align to work that's going on in the field?
Yeah, so maybe one thing that I'll say about that, Robert, and Gracie, feel free to jump in too, is that, when we think about the directions in which we would like the research areas, let me say the research areas that we would like the TIP directorate to invest in, right? How do we identify those research areas? Well, we identify those research areas through conversations such as this, through conversations with external groups, through conversations, through workshops that we run. We, in fact, ran a workshop back at the beginning, the middle of last year, in fact, thinking about the regional innovation accelerators concept and what are some of the what are some of the characteristics of what makes a regional innovation accelerator successful, but then also at the same time trying to broaden that to think about what are the topic spaces where it makes sense for us to put down an investment of that magnitude, right? So I think that as we think about the research areas that we're going to tap into, and Gracie covered it on that slide, it was for the RIAs, but I think it's emblematic of TIP as a whole, really this intersectionality between key technology areas across the spectrum of technology areas, as well as use in the societal challenges that we see. And there were 3 on that slide, and there are others as well. Part of this is the conversation that we've been having, we expect to continue to have with the research community to really understand what are the gaps, what are the opportunity spaces where TIP can really come in and have a positive impact. So that's number one. The second thing that I would say, Robert, is you're absolutely right? And I agree, pontificating or not, I appreciate very much Jerry's comment, right? The foundation of US science has been and continues to be on individual investigator, not necessarily science envisioned by others. I think that's absolutely true. And we want to be able to see NSF's budget in totality grow as a whole. And we want to be able to see the budgets for our existing directorates grow too, along with the budget for the proposed Technology Innovation Partnerships Directorate as well. And I think that we want to strike that balance through partnering where you have that individual investigator creativity that absolutely is critical. But at the same time, we also want to think about what are some of the challenges that can help motivate some of that creativity too. And it doesn't necessarily have to be industry coming in. It doesn't necessarily have to be state and local governments coming in. some of that creativity comes from an investigator who sees a problem before them and goes after that problem, right? And so I think that we're really striving for that balance there at the end of the day in terms of what we're supporting, not just through TIP, but across all of NSF too. Is that helping, Robert?
It is. It is.
Jerry should weigh in on the Q&A and tell us if that was helpful or not.
Yeah, and you might know Jerry. He was an NSF fellow that circled through. Now he's at Minnesota. He's a great colleague. Yeah. Jerry, please be happy to chime in if that answered the question sufficiently. All right, last question, and then I'm going to give you the final word. So Dr. Giacondani, this one's for you. You mentioned the R1 institutions would not be the only emphasis of TIP, but thinking about our minority serving institutions, what do you see as the role of PUIs in this initiative, given that they traditionally do not receive significant federal funding, but are a major source of STEM talent?
Yeah, so I love this question. I can't thank Brad for asking the question. PUIs, community colleges, so critical to our nation's ecosystem. As a matter of fact, I think I have said it in other conversations and not so much in this one today, but I've said it in other ones that these are institutions that really constitute the vast untapped treasure trove of talent that exists across our country. And we, NSF, I'm just going to put our name out there, we need to do a better job of reaching out to schools, like to that set of schools. So one of the things that we have really been emphasizing in conversations that we've had with our colleagues in the Education Human Resources EHR Directorate, Gracie and I, just over the course of the last 6 months or so, is thinking about the partnerships that it could exist between TIP and EHR, right? To be able to cultivate not just new instructional approaches as we think about emerging technology areas, not just thinking about the broadening participation research and work that needs to happen as well, but how do we also bring those schools together and create partnerships between PUIs and four-year universities and startups and companies as well? How do we create pathways that give our students experiential opportunities that marry what they're learning in the classroom with what practical experiences would provide for them so that they can then be ready on day one when they're graduating and when they're looking for a job, they can be ready for that job on day one in a way that, frankly, today, I would argue we are simply not doing a good enough job of preparing our students for those jobs on day one. And so I think that one of our key aspirations here is to be able to cultivate programmatics that foster experiential opportunities for students at all levels. And it starts at the K through 12 level, particularly at the high school level, and it works its way up through two-year colleges, through four-year universities, on up to graduate school or wherever a student may opt to go. And we need to recognize too that, you know, we used to talk about this as a pipeline. It's not a pipeline, it's pathways, right? Students go through different pathways and excel in different points in their career in the education, in the classroom setting, experiential opportunities, and so forth. We need to better prepare. We need to be prepared for those pathways and help our students and help our talent base. So to Brad, I would just say we look to partner with folks at PUIs, community colleges all across this country as part of the TIP mission space.
Yeah, I would just say, Erwin, to be able to do that, we're going to have to train people extensively on being able to foster that. Because philosophically, it's a little bit different at each institution. And just to highlight what you said, I do think K through 12 matters. My first research internship was when I was in high school in Denver at UC Denver, which then fostered my whole career. But I think the lack of exposure for individuals, maybe it's too late when they get to community college and college because they're already on their pathway. We need to infuse ourselves a little earlier. So thank you for that explanation and interest. All right, so Jerry agreed. He thanks you for the comment, and so that wraps up our Q&A session. You still have 170 plus individuals participating in this session. It's 6 o'clock on a Monday. That means you truly are a headliner. So I'll give both you, Gracie, and Erwin an opportunity to give any final words before we virtually thank you for your time this evening.
Gracie, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, and thank you for having us here. I think all we really want is for you to stay tuned. We're all very hopeful that we will be able to launch the TIP Directorate and some of these exciting new programs in the very near future. And then we really do need all stakeholders to engage, right? We really want to broaden the whole geography of innovation, and that requires that everybody find where they fit in and let everybody else know about it. We talked about community colleges, but I would say, you know, MSIs, tribal colleges and universities, we're really going to be looking for communities that haven't typically and traditionally engaged with NSF. And so we need everybody's help in making sure that everybody's aware of what we're doing. Thank you.
Yeah, and plus one on everything Gracie said, you know, this is a potentially once in a generation opportunity to have impact across our country and across the research ecosystem. We look forward to working with you all on it, and we hope you will look forward to working with us too.
Absolutely. And one more time, thank you, Ms. Narcho and Dr. Giancandani, for all of your insights that you shared with us related to the new directorate, and we are very optimistic about the future. So thank you again. Thank you all in FDP land. Y'all have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you all tomorrow.